right, good morning, everyone. We are continuing our study in the book of Esther today. Chapter 9, we're going to see how far we get through it. There's a chance we might finish our study today, seeing as chapter 10 is short, and depending on how fast we get through 9 today, because 9 is mostly a conclusion of what's going on that we've already read for the past couple of weeks and studied. So we will see how everything goes this morning. So we'll start off with reading chapter 9, verses 1 through 4, if someone would like to read that for me.
Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all people. All the officials of the provinces, and the satraps, and the governors, and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful.
Thank you. As we see here, the day essentially has come, as we've been leading up to for the past couple of weeks, that the pogrom is about to occur. But as we saw in chapter 8, that the decree went out by Mordecai, who is now essentially in that prime minister position, saying that Jews can defend themselves. And as we will see, which is noted at the end of verse 1, the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. So they definitely had a lot going for them at that point, because Mordecai has been in his position now for, I think, 9 months, roughly 8 to 9 months, by the time his decree went out, saying that the Jews can defend themselves and stand up for themselves. So there was a lot of time for them to essentially be prepared for what was about to happen, turning this day of mourning into a day of celebration that was going on. So with all that being said, and having been in this position in a while, as we see in verse 3, it says, all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. So the old person in Mordecai's position, Haman, sent out the decree to essentially annihilate and exterminate all the Jews. And then Mordecai came in that position, saying the exact opposite. The Jews can now defend themselves against what Haman sent out. Now, the officials, the satraps, the governors, they're all politicians. They're all pretty wishy-washy. They're going to go whoever's in that powerful position. Now, with Mordecai being in that position for quite a few months now, there's definitely be some fear there, because if they're going to go and with Haman's first decree versus Mordecai's, then they might fear Mordecai is going to come down upon them, replace them, get rid of them, kill them, you name it. So with the satraps, the governors, and all those who do the king's work going to help the Jews, it's definitely the officials coming out with the local armies, militias, whoever they have on hand, to also help defend the Jews in that position. And it notes in verse 4 that for Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. So again, we're knowing the fact that how Mordecai is very well established in his position. He is well known throughout the area, especially for what happened the past couple of years. Leading up until this point, he has definitely hit the ground running, so to speak, in his new position. Briefly jumping back up into verse 2, the Jews gathered together in the cities throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them because the fear of them fell upon the people. I think we know this back in chapter 8, that a lot of people definitely turned to God, the true God at this point, because they're seeing how great He has been to put these people in these positions and to essentially save their people. This must be the one true God and the only God. And it definitely converted a lot of people at that point as well. Does anyone have any comments, questions, or anything like that?
Just comment about Haman and these princes and all these leaders. they were all somewhat confused when that edict first came out, and then they saw what happened to Haman, I'm sure. They paid attention to that, so that would help them to be fine with that.
Absolutely. And because Mordecai in that position now, being a Jew, it's probably well known at this point that now Queen Esther is also known that she's a Jew. If they go ahead with this, are they kind of telling King Xerxes that, yeah, I know you kind of sent a decree out to nullify this to an extent, but we're going to go with that anyway, and who cares who the queen is, kind of a thing. So there's probably a lot of fear in that aspect as well. It's a very good point. Anyone else? Awesome. Then we will continue on. If someone wants to read verses 5 through 10 for me.
Thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. At the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and all of those sons of Haman, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder.
Thank you. I've always heard when it comes to difficult names like this, if you say it loud and proud and with authority, no one will actually question you if it's actually correct. Yep. Yeah, it's definitely hard when you get into the old language, all these names. It is difficult. So we all can see in the Bibles you have in front of you that the 10 sons are listed out there. But so starting back in verse 5, so thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with a stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. So they carried out what they needed to carry out. They didn't necessarily go out and seek, but they obviously defended themselves to those who had presented them to wanted them to be killed. And in verse 6, we see in Susa, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed, 500 men. So even in the citadel, there's a very heavy Jewish population where Mordecai is, where the queen is, where the king is. People were still willing to try to carry this out because they had that, as you want to call it, greed or pride still in them. That was from Haman. I'm sure there were some of his supporters and followers there, but the allure of being able to kill the Jews and take all their possessions was still technically legal because, as we saw back in previous chapters, that the king's decrees and laws cannot be changed or altered. So they were still allowed to do it, because the new decree came out saying that the Jews could defend themselves. So I'm sure some people were still greedy enough to want to go out and try to plunder as much as they can. So we see the 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. They killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. So it's not necessarily strictly noted if the sons were out trying to kill the Jews or if they were sought specifically in this standpoint. But I think in a way we see definitely God's divine providence coming out to wipe out the line of Haman. As we noted in previous chapters, but Saul failed to essentially take out the Amalekites back in the day, as we noted in 1 Samuel in chapter 15, that Saul was ordered to destroy and kill everyone, every man, woman, child, and he left King Agag alive. And then from the line of Agag comes Haman, who is an Agagite. So as we can see here, now that the bloodline has officially been eliminated, the Jews cannot be persecuted again, I guess, from the line of Agag. They were able to end that completely. Let's see here. So for the defeat of the enemies, Esther describes no time when the Lord thundered, as he did during the time of Samuel, noted in 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 10. The Jews and Esther defeated their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction. And in the king's own capital of Susa, they destroyed 500 of their enemies. And then the Haman again gave the right to plunder possessions of the Jews, and then the decree came out from Mordecai, essentially gave them the right to do the same. But they definitely did not go and do that because that was not the whole point on the Jew side. This is completely to defend themselves from annihilation. Because if the Jews were to be completely wiped out in this pogrom, it would have ended everything, right? Then Christ can't come, and so on and so forth. But as we know, everything has been set in stone and laid out, and it's going to happen, and the Jews are going to be saved one way or another, because obviously God's not going to let the Jews get completely wiped out, no matter how much wrong they do. And as we can see here, he definitely uses people who do wrong, right? Esther and Mordecai weren't the perfect people. They were fully assimilated Persians. They were in the culture. They weren't fully practicing. Mordecai commanded Esther to not practice, to hide the fact that she was a Jew, which I'm sure probably wasn't pleasing in God's eyes at the end of the day, but they were to be used for a purpose. And none of us are perfect, right? We're all here for a reason. We're all trying to do better. And the book of Esther is kind of, I think, similar to today. Now, in a certain aspect, is that now we just have kind of, God's divine providence in his hand and everything, versus, back in the days of when Christ was walking the earth and he had the apostles and disciples who were out doing works. We don't have that these days. So it's very much a, I guess, relatable situation. Another good thing to note on here, when the sons of Haman are listed by name, they died for the sins of their father, although nothing more is said of any one of them. For some reason, Jews who copied and preserved the text of Esther listed the 10 sons of Haman in a strange way. The Hebrew text has the names of the 10 men pressed against the right margin of the page. Hebrew reads from right to left. Each name has a letter meaning "and" before it, followed by a Hebrew word placed before the direct object of a noun. English has no equivalent for the Hebrew word that designates a direct object, since English indicates a direct object by word order. The significance of the listing of Haman's son goes unexplained. I thought that was really interesting, because you think about it to these days as putting, for us, it's on the left-hand side. It's like each line of the page starts with like one of their names, versus they did it on the right side. So just a really weird way to read that. It'd be cool to know more about it, but unless someone else knows anything more about it. But for us, it's, what I can tell, goes unexplained. Does anyone else have any more comments or anything on was that 5 through 10? Awesome. Then we'll go ahead and keep going, and we'll jump into 11 through 14 if someone wants to read that for me.
On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done." On?
So 14, please.
So 14, okay. Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan, and do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons.
Thank you. So it says on that day, the number of those who were killed in Susa, the citadel, was brought to the king. So I'm sure many people were definitely watching and observing kind of what was going on. And, there's murder and chaos in the street, people defending themselves. I guess they're not really murder because they're being attacked first. But, they got to do something with the bodies, right? So there's definitely going to be an official count there when there's a very heavy presence, because I'm sure it doesn't note this in here, but I imagine that the king's guard was definitely on hand and on standby, because, if there's people openly killing each other in the streets, they're not going to let that get into the palace, right? So there's probably a heavier presence. So they probably had that number pretty quick. And the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Susa, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done." With an Esther saying, "If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do again tomorrow according to the king's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done, and the decree was issued to Susa, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. So we see here that the decree got extended for another day for just Susa. So when we get into the Festival of Purim, and talk about that in a little bit, we're going to note that in much of the outlying rural areas, it's celebrated on the 14th day. But for the people in Susa, it's celebrated on the 14th and the 15th because they had it extended out to being 2 days. So it left to be, depending on where you were, I guess in the entire province at the time, kind of dictated how you celebrated the feast, which we'll get into in a little bit. But Haman's 10 sons were hanged on the gallows. And again, it's not how we think about hanging in the Old West, where it's from a rope, but it is a giant spike. That's kind of how Haman was hanged. He was, I think it was Caleb's version he was reading out of. Actually says that they put him on a spike and it was 50 feet, 75 feet, something like that in the air. Obviously not a really great death. It's pretty gruesome, but they were put out for everyone to be seen. It was also noted elsewhere that there was, I guess, it was extended out for another day because some people were still trying to, I guess, kill the Jews and extend it out, and they wanted that decree to be able to defend themselves to go out another day. So that's another reason why it also got extended, because it kind of technically goes against the king's law for them to be defending themselves another day if people are trying to kill them. But we think about today, if someone's trying to kill you, you have the right to self-defense. But hopefully they would have. I guess they need a decree to do that, so it's good. Does anyone have any comments or questions on that portion? All right. Yep, we covered that part. So let's go on to verses 15 through 17, please. If someone would like to read that.
The Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month Adar and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies, and kill 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. This was done on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing.
Thank you. So we kind of talk about a little bit again. So when it says the Jews were in Susa, gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Susa, but they did not lay hand on the plunder. Again, they weren't out to actually take anything for it besides defending themselves. And the remainder of the king's Jews and provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had a rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. So 75,000 definitely seems like a large amount, especially at the time when armies standing were at about 100,000, 200,000 in the area. But again, remember how large this kingdom was, going from Ethiopia to India. So when you have all those different areas, it's pretty easy to break that up, and 100 people killed there, 100 people killed here. It definitely can stack up to be a quite a large number, especially if you're in an area where there's not a whole lot of people. Can you imagine there's 20 Jews living in a town of 1,000? It's probably pretty easy for people that want to go and kill them and steal their plunder. But again, the satraps, the governors, and all them stood up for the Jews as well and helped them out. It's on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. So again, out in the rural areas that weren't in Susa, they feasted on the 14th day versus in the citadel themselves, they were still defending themselves on that 14th day. That's where we get that. In Susa, you have the 2 days, and elsewhere you have just the one of celebrating the festival of Purim. Something that's definitely interesting to note, the Hebrew text says that the Jews killed some 75,000 of their enemies throughout Persia. But the Greek translation from about 200 BC says that there's about 15,000 slain, which I thought was interesting, that there was the number was a little off based on other historical texts, but honestly got to go with the one that's in the Bible, because that's probably the most accurate one that's going to be laid out there. Again, more noting, saying that there was 120,000 men was probably what was used to estimate, or is estimated to be used when Xerxes invaded Greece. So just to kind of on contrast, to see he attacked someplace 120,000 men, and in one day 75,000 were killed across the kingdom of people trying to annihilate the Jews. All right, let's go ahead, and if anyone's got any comments, we'll head forward into, I think it's 18 and 19, if someone wants to read 18 and 19 for me.
But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day, and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending portions of food to one another.
Thank you. Yeah, so kind of what we kind of covered already. The day's a little off, but the festival and the feasting still definitely happened. One interesting thing to note with the Festival of Purim is that there was supposed to be no mourning whatsoever during it. So, which I imagine is probably be rough if you lost a loved one the day before and you're in mourning for that. There was commanded to be no mourning during that time for it. We'll go ahead and move forward because we kind of covered that portion, right? So if someone wants to read 20 through 25 for me.
Then Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews who were in the provinces of King Xerxes, Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to celebrate the 14th day of the month Adar and the 15th day of the same month annually, because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which was turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Thus the Jews undertook what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the son of Hammedatha and the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and destroy them. But when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that this wicked scheme which he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows.
Thank you. You see right at the beginning there that Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in the provinces of King Xerxes to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days in the month of Adar. So as you can see, the Festival of Purim is now being kind of laid out and set into stone. And where we get the name, as we see down in verse 24, as we saw before in earlier chapters as well, but Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them and had cast Pur, that is the lot, to consume them and destroy them. So when they add I think I have this noted somewhere in here. When they added I'm not great with the Hebrew word for it on it. But essentially, they're kind of talking before, like with the names, they added their, what is that? It's not context. It's like their adjectives towards it or something like that. That's how you got the M. But it's the festival of essentially the lot or the dice, because the dice was thrown to determine the day that they were to be annihilated. It's now the name of the festival after it because that was the day that was selected for them to be annihilated. As we can see here, it kind of sounds like almost like Christmas, right? They're gathering together, they're feasting, they're giving gifts, they're doing stuff for the poor, doing things for one another, and it was just noted in verse 23 that the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun as Mordecai had written to them. So they kind of established this to go out through, and it's interesting because it's not necessarily a feast or festival that is like in the law of Moses, right? So it's something that they developed on themselves, and it's actually noted further on that it does not really get mentioned very much once we get into New Testament times. Like Jesus doesn't mention anything about the Feast of Purim or anything like that because it wasn't. Some Jews saw it as not being required because obviously it was something they developed themselves, being freed or defending themselves against the pogrom. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged in the gallows, which we saw in earlier verses that the sons were hung from there. I thought I had one more note on this particular area. So the Jews embraced Mordecai's decree, and the Feast of Purim became a permanent fixture among the Jewish people. The author reminded the readers of Esther that the feast was born out of a desire of the Haman the Agagite to annihilate the Jews. His plot was turned against him when he and his sons were hanged on the gallows. And then Purim took its name from the Babylonian word for lots. There are times when things simply need to be arranged in some orderly sequence, and sequence itself is of little importance. At the beginning of football games, it's often done by a coin toss or casting the lots. We come back to talking about the dice. All right, we'll move forward into 26 through 32. If someone wants to read that. Oh, yes, ma'am.
The king, though, too, I mean, he had to take that decree that he sent out because Haman used his ring to sign that it was coming from the king to destroy all of the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So he had to have, let people know that this is no longer what needs to be done, and therefore his family and that will be hanged and stuff like that. But still, the Jews had to take care of some enemies that had not followed the king either at that time, and went ahead and wanted to plot to kill the Jews. So there's a lot going on in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the same time.
Yeah, the king was definitely in a weird predicament because he didn't want to make it seem like he was the one that was wanting to annihilate that. That's why his entire family, Haman's entire family, was wiped out from that aspect. And the decree with the festival, like celebrating Purim and stuff, we went out. It was definitely of a significant importance to help. I want to say bury the first decree that Haman sent out, but it definitely was to end that. And that decree, luckily, was only go out for that one day as well. It wasn't every year on this day you have to go kill the Jews. It was supposed to be one and done. So it was definitely good that they were able to get past that point. Baxter.
I was just noticing earlier in verse 12 how extra nice the king seemed to be to Esther. Like, is there anything else I can do for you? Because as king, he kind of should have caught that. I mean, the whole thing, I would think he should have, the buck stops with him. He should have investigated Haman of why he wanted this to happen. But he just kind of trusted him and went with it.
Yeah, and it's something I was thinking about earlier too. I think back in chapter 3 and 4 when that first decree started coming about, and then Haman, kind of devised this plan. Is he was in a trusted position, so the king didn't really fully care on what he did. And I think we talked about this before weeks ago now, but the king also might have been able to read because it was something that he didn't have time to study or learn because he had all these scribes to do things. So ignorance isn't a very good defense, but he also probably didn't know what was in that letter fully unless somebody read it to him ahead of time. Yes, ma'am.
Presenting it to the king, he was talking about Mordecai, not the whole Jewish nation at the time. So when he wrote the letter, I agree with you, I don't think the king knew everything about it. He just thought it was going to be one man or, a little group or something. He had let it go, but there again, he's the king. He should have demanded to have, the letter come back to him and let him read it first. But he trusted him, so he thought he would be doing, this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
This is such an interesting political experience because he essentially enacted civil war for 2 days amidst his entire empire and sacrificed taxpayers, future soldiers, power, and it would be just so confusing both inside and outside of the kingdom to wonder why somebody would cut down their kingdom size so significantly over 2 days.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's weird, and I think it's when the decree goes out, was it chapter 4 or 5? that a lot of people were very confused, especially in Susa, the Citadel, right? People were confused on why that first decree went out to essentially nowadays people because they had no knowledge of Mordecai not wanting to bow down to Haman coming through and the Jews' customs and all that. So it's definitely weird on why, again, the king would allow that to happen. My mind is wandering this morning. I had another point that you reminded me of. We're going to touch on that a little bit in chapter 10, verse 1. There's something else that was there. I don't remember. Maybe it'll come back to me a little bit. But good point. Anyone else? Awesome. Then let's move forward to, let's say 26 to 32, please.
Therefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur, and because of the instructions in this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what that had happened to them. The Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for their descendants and for all of those who allied themselves with them, so that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days according to their regulation and according to their appointed time annually. So that these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews or their memory fade from their descendants. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. He sent letters to all Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Azarias, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for the descendants with instructions for their times of fasting and their lamentations. The command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book.
Thank you. I kind of halfway remember now. Haman was a wicked man, right? So when he was going through, he was obviously being very deceptive to the king and not telling exactly what was going on going to this decree. But he also put that large amount of money into the coffers of the king, right? He's like, hey, we're going to do this, and I'm actually going to pay for it for you. Here's all this money. So the king is like, cool, what's a couple people versus these millions of dollars that you deposited into my coffers? So the king might not have fully cared because he was still getting money to a standpoint to him. Maybe getting that that money up front was also good because they just had two very expensive wars that they just had to pay for. But again, that trade-off of 75,000 people who are that tax money coming in is definitely quite a bit of a loss. It was on verse 26. So they call these days Purim after the name Pur. Therefore, because all the words in this letter that they had seen had concerning this matter of what happens to them. So we see the establishment of the feast of the name, and then the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time. And it goes on about how it should not be failed to be observed. But then jumping down to 29, Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim, and Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes with words of peace and truth, and to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time that Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them as they had decreed for themselves and the descendants concerning the matters of fasting and lamenting. It's a lot of words, but essentially we're saying that the second letter, so the first letter that went out was essentially to celebrate this, the festival of Feast of Purim at one time, right? So they got rid of their, aggressors. They defended themselves. We did it. We celebrated. Awesome. But the second letter is coming out saying that, hey, it's actually pretty cool. We're going to do this every year now. It's now going to be a fully established holiday, if you will, and we're going to celebrate it these 2 days every year according to everything that has been prescribed and written. And then to confirm these days, wrong one. It's the decree that Esther has confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. It's not exactly noted what they mean by the book, if it was Mordecai keeping his own separate notes, or if it was actually put like in the chronicles that the king kept, because we kept very extensive records of everything that happened in the kingdom, from happenings in the court, from happenings of war. We see that the king, we noted back in a couple chapters ago, the king had the chronicles read to him. That's how it was discovered that Mordecai was never actually rewarded for foiling a plot against the king's life. So it was most likely written down in one of those records that were kept, so that way it was very well known from time and time to come. Does anyone got any comments? Yes, ma'am.
We have next door neighbors who are Jewish, and they had, and sometime in March, celebrated for 2 days. It was a big family thing, and a lot of people came to their house, and they had a big party. It was interesting.
Yeah, and it's celebrated moderately between, I think it's the 25th of February and the 25th of March, somewhere in there, because it changes, like you said. So it was in March this year, you said. Yeah, I don't really know how their calendar works, but for what I was reading, like their calendar fluctuates, so it kind of goes somewhere in there. It's actually very interesting that someone was actually still celebrating it. That's pretty neat. Anyone else? Awesome, then we'll get into chapter 10 and finish this off. So let's go ahead and just read verses 1 through 3 on chapter 10.
Now King Ahasuerus laid a tribute on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the king of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation.
Thank you. So see verse 1 right there. So King Xerxes imposed tribute on the land, and on the islands of the sea. So essentially, he instituted a tax. So he was then collecting money, or a new tax was getting imposed. It doesn't say necessarily exactly what the tax was for, but it was probably to help, again, make up for the fact that 75,000 people just got eliminated from his kingdom that were paying taxes. So the tax got hiked up a little bit in order to collect it. So it's noted in here, it was a testimony to Xerxes' greatness and power that he collected tribute from the lands and the islands off the sea that he had conquered. But to speak of the greatness of Xerxes was also to speak the greatness of Mordecai. He must have served well. The king advanced him to the position of next to his own, and all this is written in the chronicles of the kings of the Medians and the Persians. And Mordecai not only established himself in the presence of the king, but was also great and well received. It's noted that he brought peace amongst his countrymen. In verse 3, it says, Mordecai, the Jew, was second to King Xerxes, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking good of his people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. So he was, after that civil war happened, he kind of leveled everything out. He did a very good job, as it's noted here. He spoke peace to everybody. There's definitely not a lot of discrimination going on other sides at that point anymore. And then stepping back briefly to verse 2, now all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? So it was noted in the permanent, or in their records, that the chronicles that were kept forever, how great Mordecai was and how good he was in this position, and time again to come. I think I had one conclusion point here. Does anyone have any comments or anything? Yes, ma'am.
I think this is one of the evidences of the providential background of Esther, because in secular history, almost never do humans achieve power and then stop and say, no, this is enough power. The Jews have now done what they needed to do, should not continue rising through the ranks of power and privilege. We're done, peace. That almost never happens in secular history. We've seen time and time again that once humans achieve power or organizations achieve power, they never stop growing until they either collapse or just continue growing. We don't get to see their collapse yet. And I think that's an incredibly different perspective for them to have achieved a pretty high status of power and then stop and say that's enough.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more because they definitely easily probably could have taken over if they really wanted to, with Mordecai being in that position that he has full access to the king. If they really wanted to, they could have. And to your point, it was definitely God's divine providence going on through here. Everything happened exactly how it was supposed to happen, and once everything was done, it was done, right? So they ended it saying that Mordecai was great, and there was peace pretty much amongst his countrymen. So I think it's a very good point. Yes, ma'am.
Me?
Yes.
I just think it's interesting that if the king hadn't been infatuated with Esther, how things could have gone.
Yeah, and again, we see God's divine providence to make that happen because we noted back in chapter 2 and 3, when they're gathering all the young girls amongst the kingdom and they're going through all of their preparedness to be with the king for one night. You had hundreds of girls, and Esther just immediately stood out for her beauty, her grace, for everything was immaculate, which again can only be described through God's divine providence. Yes, ma'am.
Interesting to see that Mordecai, who sat at the king's gate in sackcloth and ashes and poor, became the second in command to the king. And that's unusual also, so God definitely was in charge of what's going on.
Yeah, he used Mordecai exactly how he needed to be used and put him in the position that he exactly needed to be in. As you kind of said before, he uses, against not fully, when I say not great people, but people who aren't perfect, he uses them how they need to be used. And as we saw, Mordecai had faith in God pretty much the entire time, right? It's not fully noted, not talking about God whatsoever from the book of Esther, but his faith that something was going to work out. Because you remember, he told Esther back when he was mourning in sackcloth and ash that, are you going to do nothing? Like, now is the time to do something. You're in a position to do it. If you don't do it, God will make it happen another way. So something else will happen, whether you're involved or not. And then that's when she commanded that the 3 days of fasting. And then she went to the king. She's like, well, I'm going to die regardless, so I might as well try. And then, she tried and had everything carried through. So it's another really good point. Anyone else? Yes, Baxter.
Mikhail had said, like the very visual thing of them not taking what they could have was them leaving all the plunder. I mean, they're killing thousands of people and they're not taking the stuff. That was a normal thing in the ancient world, but they did not do it. And the other thing, we talked about the name of God not being mentioned in this book. A couple months ago, we noticed that if the story of Joseph is the lecture, the book of Esther is the quiz, and God is the answer.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, I think something I skipped over in here, if I can find it real quick, was noting something about Abram. At least I thought I wrote my note down about it. Maybe I didn't. Oh, I guess I didn't write it down. But we'll take Baxter's point on that one. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Another thing to keep in mind is the stark contrast to what the Jews did by stopping and not taking more power. Haman kept seeking more power. Once he got promoted, he wanted everybody to bow down to him. And then all of this was caused because of that.
Mm-hmm.
His own pride and hubris caused 75,000 people to die, caused all of these Jews to go through turmoil, and all of the nation to go through turmoil just because of his own pride. So it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's a very good point. As you talked about a couple weeks ago about how deadly pride can be and how pride can lead to more wrongdoings and to more sin. As you also noted the fact that he wanted to be, I guess, he praised and seen, so Mordecai wasn't bowing down to him and led this whole thing. And then when the king called to him, once the chronicles read to him and discovered that Mordecai wasn't honored, that Haman was like, oh, if you want to honor someone, you should put him on your own horse. You should put him in your own robe. You should parade him through the town. He wanted those things to be done for him. And yet the humility and the humbleness of Mordecai was essentially he was the one that was paraded through by Haman, which again led him down an even deeper path because now his pride was also hurt because he's a very prideful man. And it, again, led to his downfall, as you noted. So that's a very good point. Anyone else? Awesome. Well, then I think we'll conclude our study on the book of Esther. It's definitely been exciting and fun to be teaching this. I think we're moving on to who's teaching next. We're still figuring it out. We're moving on to something next week. Maybe it'll be a little surprise study. We'll never know. We'll see. But thanks, everyone.